Okay, hello Cloud Gurus and welcome to this lecture. In this lecture, we're going to look at security basics. So this section of the course is going to be very theoretical. There's not going to be any labs in section 2. We will move on to labs in section 3. I, for one, hate theory, but you do need to understand the basics in order to have a good foundation in which to pass your exam. Now, essentially, in the old exam blueprint in 2017, basically they had 3 different models inside, inside the exam blueprint around security, and these models were CIA, AAA, and non-repudiation. Now, they have actually taken that out of the new exam blueprint for 2018, and I did not see any of these topics in my exam. They definitely were in the first one, but they are not in the second. That being said, though, if you go for a job interview, you need to understand the 3 different models: the CIA, the AAA, and the non-repudiation, sometimes referred to as the triad. So I'm going to leave this lecture in. Do feel free if you want, if you already know what CIA, AAA, and non-repudiation is, feel free to skip ahead, but it is worth knowing, especially if you plan on working in the security field. Okay, so let's start with the CIA model. And CIA does not stand for Central Intelligence Agency as much as you want it to. It actually stands for confidentiality, integrity, and then availability. So let's talk through these 3 points. And by the way, sometimes these 3 points can be referred to as the triad. So confidentiality is basically the equivalent to privacy. So if you think about your data, let's say it's your healthcare data, maybe it's you've had a DNA test done that measures your disease risks on 23andme.com. That is very obviously confidential information that you would like to keep private to yourself, but you might want to share it with your wife and children so that they know that you've got a predisposition towards skin cancer or something like that. So confidentiality doesn't mean that you have to keep it absolutely secret to yourself. It's basically information that you want to keep confidential, but you want to expose to other third parties as well where it's needed. Another good example would be like your bank statements, for example. You want to be able to see the transactions that you've made on your bank card, and you might want to be able to share them with your spouse so that she can see, or he can see that you're not going out and blowing all your money on, I don't know, fancy restaurants or whatever. But at the same time, you don't want to show your colleagues that because that's confidential information. So confidentiality is the equivalent of privacy. So some good examples of ensuring confidentiality are things like using data encryption, so encrypting our data at rest, encrypting our data in transit. Things like user IDs and passwords basically form confidentiality and guarantee your privacy. Things like two-factor authentication, which we use in identity access management. You can now get biometric verifications. So, most iPhones and Android tablets have biometric verification in that you have to have your fingerprint over the device to be able to log in. And even the iPhone 10 or the iPhone X now does facial recognition in order for you to be able to sign into your device. So confidentiality, think of that as basically privacy. So integrity involves maintaining consistency, accuracy, and trustworthiness of data over its entire life cycle. So you don't want your data to change in transit, and you've got to also ensure that data cannot be altered by unauthorized people, and this would obviously breach confidentiality. So things to think about in terms of integrity are things like file permissions and user access controls. Version control might also be there to stop erroneous changes or accidental deletions. And then other examples of this would be some things like checksums. So if you ever go and download a piece of software, there will always be a checksum next to it. And then you can essentially, once you've downloaded it, you can check the hash of that software to the checksum. And if they match, then you know that the data is integral. And then availability is simply just keeping your systems available. So you don't want hardware failure to bring, down, let's say, the stock exchange or something like that. You want redundancy over everything. So you want your disks to be rated. You want high availability clusters. You want multiple availability zones, multiple regions, and you want to design for failure as well, so that you basically will have very, very high availability. Okay, so now that you understand a little bit about the CIA model or the triad model, you might be wondering how this relates to the Certified Security Specialty exam. Well, what's going to happen is you're going to get a bunch of different AWS services, and it will ask you something like, like, identify in the CIA model which services are most closely aligned with confidentiality, something like that. So confidentiality, obviously you want to keep your data confidential, so we would use things like identity access management and multi-factor authentication to keep people out. You might also use things like bucket policies. We might use things like security groups or access control lists within our VPC. You can think of a whole bunch of different things to keep your data confidential, including encryption. In terms of availability, obviously we are looking at things like auto-scaling, multiple availability zones, multiple regions. We could be using things like Route 53 with health checks, etc., to help us detect failure and automatically fail over. And then integrity, we obviously, AWS have their own SSL service now, so they've got certificate managers, so Amazon can actually issue you with a SSL certificate. So certificate managers is a good way of keeping your data with good integrity. Again, encryption, as well as things like identity access management and bucket policies that will keep people who don't have the right to access your data away and keep the integrity of the data. And also things like inside S3, so things like version control, multi-factor authentication when you're trying to delete things inside S3. You can require that somebody provides an MFA token before that object is deleted, etc. So that's what you're going to be tested on. So just understand what the CIA model is, and then the different AWS services that relate to the different, different corners of the model. Okay, so we then have the AAA model, which is designed to essentially extend or to complement the CIA model. And the AAA model makes up of three things: authentication, authorization, and accounting. So I want you to imagine every time you log into the AWS platform or console, the very first thing you do is you enter in your username and password. That is authenticated against identity access management. It checks whether or not there is a user with that username and password. And if the username and password are correct, you can log into the AWS console. Once you've logged in, your ability to spin up EC2 instances or provision S3 buckets, etc., all depends on how much permissions that you have within the AWS platform. And that's set by policies. So that is really authorizations. How much are you authorized to do on the AWS platform? Can you provision EC2 instances? Can you create new S3 buckets? Or is your access only read-only because you work in the billing department? So authorization just basically covers what you can do after you've authenticated. And then accounting has nothing to do with numbers or finance. Accounting is around what is it that you're doing on the AWS platform? What is the audit trail? And that is basically covered by CloudTrail. Once you turn CloudTrail on, every single API call that you make within AWS is recorded and logged. So that is the AAA model. So what are my exam tips? Well, you just need to understand the three different models. You don't even need to really memorize what the acronyms stand for, but of course it would help. But fundamentally understanding the different models. So CIA was confidentiality, integrity, and availability. AAA is authentication, authorization, and accounting. And then non-repudiation is you cannot repudiate something, so you can't deny that you did something. Now, where you'll see these different models in the exam is that they will give you a scenario question, and they'll say which model would best protect against this type of situation, or which model should you implement in order to achieve your end goals, etc. So just understand the nuances for each different model. So that's it for this lecture, guys. If you have any questions, please let me know. If not, feel free to move on to the next lecture. Thank you.